Well, hello. I'm sorry about the lighting. I'm still in an apartment with a coworker and his wife, and though they're good folks, they're actually Ron Paul supporters. I just assumed they didn't know I had a YouTube channel or that it was a gay anarcho-capitalist. That would just probably not be the end of the world, but not the best thing. And I wouldn't want my boss to know I was making YouTube videos, which that would probably eventually entail. So I'm making this in a parking lot. I did see a squad car not far from here, so I certainly hope that they don't decide to go fishing and earn their paycheck tonight by harassing me. But I don't think that's very likely. So I wanted to talk about an issue here that I've thought about a lot, which is kind of in the background of the libertarian movement that people who are familiar with it eventually come into contact with. And it's something that, since I don't know the cause of it really, I don't like the argument. I didn't want to go there, but an article I read a few days ago really brought it up. Now the article was by Ed Crane, who's the co-founder of the Cato Institute, and basically it was actually a good article about Ron Paul, about why he should be supported, and a lot of the good things about him. But if you're a libertarian and you read it, and especially if you know a thing or two about libertarianism, it it demonstrated a rift in the libertarian movement that is not evident to people who aren't, you know, fairly decently well informed about the movement. And this is a rift between the Koch brothers and their satellite institutions, which include Reason Magazine, the Cato Institute, and George Mason University, and other libertarians that you would say either cluster around Murray Rothbard, Mises, Lou Rockwell, and the Mises Institute. Um, and it's a really kind of an ugly debate that I wish wasn't there, and I don't know the reason that it is. But just to give you some idea, if you can find this article, I'd put a link if I could find it. Like, I'm sure anyone who really wants to know, ask me, I'll try and find it, but you might be able to find it. Just type Ed Crane, Ron Paul news the last week or two. It was interesting because he was defending Paul, but then he goes on to say that Paul should disassociate himself from whoever wrote these newsletters, these racist newsletters. And then they go on to name the person as Lou Rockwell. That Ron Paul should, quote, disassociate and even condemn Lou Rockwell. Now, this is an absolutely absurd suggestion. That, I mean, just on the face of it, to just tell a politician to completely disconnect in every way a person that he has been as closely involved with as anybody on such a small matter is asking a lot. It would look bad for any politician to just come out and say, oh, this person who I've known for 30 years, who's my chief of staff, who I've given lectures for and with and to and interviewed many, many times, and just say, oh, I disavow them completely. That would look real bad. It would look especially bad for Ron Paul, and especially for these newsletters, which, for all of the vindictive, political correct policing that the media has, is not really hurting Paul very much. In fact, I don't know if it's hurting him at all. Um, and so for Ed Crane to say that Ron Paul should disassociate from Rockwell strikes me as extraordinary. What's even more extraordinary is he talks about Paul and how he has a legacy, this intellectual pedigree of all these libertarians, and he names several, Hayek and Milton Friedman, which is odd, and a couple other that I've never even heard of, which is also odd. But the one name that is conspicuous in its absence is Murray Rothbard. Why? Well, one thing is Murray Rothbard has a long history with Ron Paul. They both cite each other favorably. Rothbard wrote what I have to say is the greatest endorsement that Ron Paul has ever received as a preface to his book, The Case for Gold, Paul's book, The Case for Gold. They worked together for a very long time. And the implication, directly implied in the article, is that Rothbard... Oh, and then Ed Crane, I said he's the co-founder of Cato. Who's the other co-founder of Cato? Murray Rothbard. So there is absolutely no way that... I mean, no way. It is a purposeful omission on Ed Crane's part to not say Murray Rothbard. And he implies that Rothbard's a racist and that he's not libertarian. This is the guy who is Mr. Libertarian. No one, and this is not to say that I agree with everything Murray Rothbard ever said or his entire style or anything. Nobody has a better claim to that title in history than Murray Rothbard. Nobody. And to say he's not libertarian strikes me as amazing. Now, this kind of brushes a couple issues. Now, the liberals like to basically talk of the Koch brothers as like the evil people behind the Tea Party and all conservatism, and liberals in their characteristic foolishness have said some of the most outlandish things I've ever heard about the Koch brothers. I've heard that Frederick Bastiat is the fact that anyone has read the law, or that is because of the Koch brothers, and this is, I mean, absurd on its face that the Koch brothers would have that kind of influence. The Koch brothers are billionaires. They are very wealthy and they are very powerful, but they are not behind libertarianism. They're behind a number of prominent libertarian organizations, the ones I outlined, and a whole bunch of other ones that are lesser known. But Reason, Cato, and George Mason University are the big ones. But it's interesting because when I first heard about the evil of the Koch brothers, it wasn't from liberals. It was pre-Tea Party days, and it was from Justin Raimondo, who he claims, and I don't know if this is true, coined the term the Kochtapus, a term describing their network of subsidized charities, NGOs, whatnot. And whether it's true or not, the point is the Kochs do not support the Ludwig von Mises Institute. They do not support Lew Rockwell, and they do not support Murray Rothbard or his writings. They support Cato and Reason and George Mason, and there is that this is conspicuous, and that there is some kind of feud between the two sides, either personally between the Kochs and Rothbard, or between the Kochs and Rockwell or his institute. The story is, and this is from Rockwell, that I've heard this several times, when he decided he wanted to start a Mises Institute, the Kochs told him no. Not only would they not support it, which is fine, they don't have to support a Mises Institute if they don't want to, and there's nothing wrong with them spending money supporting causes that they like. Even if I think that their kind of libertarianism is not my kind, they have every right to spend the money they want, and on net, I'm happy that they do it. We're better off having Reason and Cato and George Mason than just having the Mises Institute, even though I firmly find myself more inclined to support and like and revere the Mises Institute than their operations. But I'm glad Reason, it gets a little embittered. People like Raimondo and a couple of the other really Rothbardian partisans, who I'll get to in a minute, are, I think, a little too dismissive of some of the Koch enterprises than they should be. But at the end of the day, I'm definitely a Mises person. And the idea that you would not support Mises because he's too radical, or that he was too much of a meanie, or he wasn't popular enough, to me, strikes me as really a huge miscarriage of reason, if not of justice. So, if you want to look into this, I've only heard 3 pieces of media that really deal with this in detail. One, it's a video, and it's an interview that Tom Woods did as he was the guest host on Peter Schiff's show with Lew Rockwell. And you can listen to the whole interview. I'm sure it's on LewRockwellShow.com. It's probably also somewhere on the Peter Schiff show. If you type it on YouTube, you find it. I favorited it maybe a few days ago, so if you look on my favorites list, you'll probably find it. And Rockwell talks about this, and that's very informative. And Rockwell says that Charles Koch, one of the Koch brothers, was actually at one point a Rothbardian, which makes this all seem a lot more interesting. But he makes it sound like he is no longer a Rothbardian. I don't know if that's true. The other 2 places that I've heard it explicitly discussed is in a website titled The Daily Bell. Now, The Daily Bell is actually a very interesting website. I don't frequent websites, but when I am bored and I'll go and find their website, and they have interesting things. They are Swiss anarcho-capitalists / conspiracy theorists. So if you are interested in the NWO, they have a wonderful synthesis of real sound anarcho-capitalist, free market Austrian economic, Austro-libertarianism, and conspiracy theorists. They'll talk about the Anglo-American establishment, the Bilderbergs, all that stuff. And they're better than people like Alex Jones, in the sense that, although I like Alex Jones and one of my favorite subscribers, Sferon, called him the world's most famous minarchist bulldog, which I think is a fair title for someone like Jones. He does not synthesize real economic theory or political theory into his ideology as far as he should. Um, Basically, the people at the Daily Bell, they can make an argument for anarcho-capitalism with or without any reference to the NWO. And in the event, they did 2 interviews, one with George Joe Salerno, and the other one with Peter Betke. Now, Salerno is one of the partisan Rothbardians who I think, if you listen to his lectures and you read some of the things he's written, it's a little bit too personal. And I will say this also for Rothbard. If you read some of Rothbard's stuff, it's a little too personal. I think he gets a little too vindictive sometimes, which might be a personality trait that has either caused and or contributed to this divide. The other interview was for Peter Betke, and this is what's so odd about this. Peter Betke is a market anarchist. He believes in an abolition of the government, at which point I don't find any reason to really disagree. If he has methodological differences with other Austrians like Rothbard, I find myself not really caring if they believe the state should be abolished. And here you have Peter Betke, who believes that the state should be abolished, but yet I don't know, he annoys me, and he annoys the other Austro-libertarians who are Misesians, and I don't know why. I just don't. But I'll say, look, I agree with him on that, so let's just let him. Anyway, they did a very in-depth interview with him and Joe Salerno, so if you go on their archives and look them up, I would highly recommend doing that. Very, very interesting. They both talk about it. Salerno's, he sounded more conciliatory than I've heard him say in other places. And part of it, I think, is that Rothbard was a radical, and he espoused radicalism, and that's why he endorsed certain things that I think were bad ideas, like appeals to populism, like appeals to the paleo-conservatives. Rothbard for a time supported Pat Buchanan, and all these newsletter things kind of come from that period where there was kind of a concerted effort to fuse anarcho-capitalism with conservatism, which sounds like a good idea, but turned out to be a bad idea, and I think they all realize it. And I think that what we're seeing now with Ron Paul is the actual fruition of a much better strategy of, let's just be honest and be consistent and make the good argument. That's what it seems like is happening to me. This is, of course, like the Nokian version, which, of course, the Nokian Isaiah's job version is not Isaiah should change his message to appeal to a certain large minority or whatever, which is what paleo-conservatism would mean, although paleo-conservatives are not a large minority. But that looks like what they tried the first time and it didn't work. But the Kochs apparently are against radicalism, which, again, they're okay with that. But if you look at like the people at George Mason, as much as we might agree with them or find what they say refreshing relative to everybody else, a good example a lot of people have probably seen is like Don Boudreaux, who used to be on Freedom Watch all the time. He's not on it so much anymore. And he'll get on there and say, we don't need a Fed. That's ridiculous. The Fed hurts the economy and we don't need a Fed. Well, that's very refreshing. But if you listen to Peter Betke, he does not bring his message to the people. He does not go out and write popular articles. He does academic research, and that's fine, but it's like we need populism. We need to bring our ideas to the masses. And I think this is the great juxtaposition between the Kochian and then the Rothbardian / Rockwellian / Ron Paulian Mises Institute. The Kochs are multi-billionaires, and they have supremely well-funded their organizations like Cato and Reason and George Mason in a way that the Mises Institute has never been able to have that kind of financing. And yet, and this is anecdotal, I don't know if I can quantify this, it seems to me that the Mises Institute has had much, much more effect on popular culture and society at large. Much more effect. With less money, without the billionaire backers, they do have wealthy donors, but they're not anything like the Kochs, either in their absolute amounts or in their consistency in donating. You have a principled guy, Lou Rockwell, who we may not agree with on everything. He's made mistakes, like an appeal to paleo-conservatives for one. He's not the quintessential libertarian because he's Well, no, that's not true. There's actually a debate there too. He's arch Catholic and he's socially conservative, it seems, and this runs afoul of people at like Reason who are kind of trendy. Okay, I feel like I'm talking Reason when I'm describing Nick Gillespie, which I don't have anything against Nick Gillespie per se, but uh, they came out, they were ideologically pure, they made their case, and after a couple years, after 15, 20 years, it really started to catch. And the Mises Institute now is very, very influential, as is LouRockwell.com. And they, despite not having, it's just amazing too. What if the, who's ever heard of George Mason? You know, I have really well informed subscribers, but I'd warrant that many of you, when I mention George Mason, aren't sure what I'm talking about. Uh, and that just goes to show how I think they made a mistake in deciding that's the way they want to go, because they've spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, probably not billions, maybe over 30 years, who knows, and yet they've had less of a splash and less of an impact. And Ron Paul is definitely, without question, in the Mises Institute Rockwell Rothbard vein and not the Koch brothers vein. I don't know about other Tea Partiers. There's a couple Tea Partiers who are definitely Ron Paulians, like Justin Amash, who I should probably do more videos about, trumpeting him. But or Rand Paul, for instance, who also personally knew Rothbard. I know a lot of libertarians are suspicious of Rand, and he's a politician, so we should be suspicious, but he actually knew Rothbard for a long time. Uh, if you compare that to the success of George Mason, I mean, what's the point? They'll say they've graduated a whole bunch of doctorate students in economics, but have you even heard of these people? I mean, I've heard some of them are really brilliant. There's a couple that Betke would talk about all the time, but I've never seen them on television. I've never seen them make convincing YouTube videos, demolishing the status arguments used to justify horrible economic policy. Never. And that's all I do pretty much in my spare time is cruise the tubes and the Facebook. Where are all Peter Betke's videos where he does it? There's very few. There's very, very, very few. I mean, the only one I've seen of Peter Betke is when he has a debate with Brian Kaplan about whether Kaplan is an is an Austrian or not. And that's it. I don't see them coming out and saying, "Look, the Fed is evil." I don't come them out saying Obama's economics are stupid. I don't see that. That's what the Mises Institute does. Now, it's been argued, and this is correct, that the Mises Institute is biased, that they take the Misesian Rothbardian, with an emphasis actually on the Rothbardian, at least when it comes to politics, ideology, and that they are partisan. They do not teach Keynesianism. But I give them a pass because they frankly admit that. It would be different if the Mises Institute was called the Economic Institute, and they said, we just study economics, and which they would say that they do, but they're upfront. They believe in a certain kind of economics, and they're very aware that not everyone believes that, and they're explicit about that. They don't pretend that there's something other than what they are. They're not like all the reporters, oh, there's a car, who claim they're objective when they can't be objective. It's a myth to have objectivity like that. No offense to Rand. And so the best thing you can hope for is honesty and say, okay, I have a bias. I'm a Republican, and I'm going to go do a report on Obama. Fine. You know, at least we know your biases, and we know the Mises Institute's biases. What's George Mason's bias? We don't really know. I mean, we do. It's anti-Rothbardian, but still libertarian. It's weird. And Rockwell said, you can be an anarchist there. That doesn't matter. You just can't be a radical. I don't know how you could be I don't know how you can be an anarchist and not be a radical. But that was Rockwell's allegation. So basically, I mean, I can spin my tires here, but I don't know why this rift happened. I think it's clear that whatever we might say about the fineries of methodology or whatever, that the Mises Institute has done far more than the many millions of dollars that the Kochs have. They have more influence and that they are more ideologically powerful, which in the end is, I mean, the point of having money is to translate that into ideological and social power. And if you can do that without money, then so much the better. And or with less money. The Mises Institute doesn't have no money, but it has less than George Mason or Cato. But the other thing is that this is incredibly petty. And as much as I might disagree with things that people have done in the past, I don't want to harp on Betke, and I don't want to harp on Brian Kaplan. I like Brian Kaplan and Peter Betke, and I like Don Boudreaux, and I like that George Mason is there, and I like that Reason is there, and I like that Cato is there, and where we part company, fine. That I'm not going to hate them. I'm not going to say they're not libertarian. I'm not going to say that they're bad or that they're evil. If they do say something that's bad, every once in a while, like during the Iraq War, some of the people at Reason came out for the war, and that was bad. But I don't know to what extent you can say that was only Reason. I think you'd have to go person by person there. So I don't know what that is. I mean, Rothbard, to be fair, I think does have a bit of a cult of personality. And I think it's most obvious in people like Joe Salerno and David Gordon and a few others. But it's a bit. Like, the Kochs don't have a cult of personality. But they have, like, the opposite. They have an anti-cult of personality where you can't be a Rothbardian, where it's bad. If you're a Rothbardian, then this is most evidence in this Crane article that says that Rothbard's not, that he's not a libertarian and that Ron Paul should disassociate with him and Rockwell. And that's just completely absurd. And to me, it discredits somebody like Crane, who the only thing I know about him is that he's an anti-Rothbardian. Well, that doesn't get you very far. What are his positive contributions to existence? I don't know. But if he makes libertarian ones, fine. And Cato does that, so that's great. Cato's not as good as the Mises Institute, in my opinion, but I'm glad that they're there. And I wish this would go away, and I wish that people would get over it and they'd talk to each other. And I would also wish that, and this is going to sound like I'm not being conciliatory because I'm coming down on one side, but okay, I'll admit my bias. I am coming down on one side. I think that what the Kochs have done, although they have entitled to it, is not getting them what they wanted. The story is that they said, look, we're getting Reagan, we should be happy with Reagan. And so we should not be radical. We should not be coming out and saying how bad Reagan is when he's what we want. And that route was a disaster. Just like the whole Rockwell pretending to be a paleo-conservative was a disaster. Except this was a way bigger disaster. Reagan didn't get us anywhere. And if they had poured all their money into the Mises Institute back in 1982, who knows where we'd be now. That's neither here nor there, I suppose. So, this isn't a death to the Kochtapus because the Kochs are entitled to their money and they're entitled to spend it. Of course, there's allegations that they engage in rent seeking from the government or whatever, and I don't know. In order to be that rich, it's like inevitable that you do that. I mean, you can't even be in business without getting a license. Whatever it is they do, I think they own like oil and gas, but I'm not positive. You can't do that without getting some indirect government subsidy. So I'm not going to go too bad as long as they're not actively lobbying to put their competitors out of business or whatever, or getting direct subsidies. I'm not going to be too harsh on them. I'll criticize the whole system, but not particular actors who don't really have a choice other than to give up their business. That's asking too much. So anyway, if anybody has any other ideas about where this bad blood comes from, if it's personal, I'm thinking maybe Rothbard had a big argument. He's written about it, but never. He writes about it in The Betrayal of the American Right and a couple of his other articles, but he does not. There's clearly something else going on. I don't know if they got in a fight or what. He and Charles Koch or David Koch, or I don't know what happened. I guess I'm curious, but at this point it doesn't matter. Rothbard's dead, so it doesn't matter, right? It shouldn't matter. It's not a methodological or an ideological debate, as far as I can tell. At least in terms of not having libertarianism or having libertarianism, it just seems like a personal feud. So, anyway, that's it. I hope you were able to listen to this, even though this is just kind of a dark, blurry face with bad backlighting. But whatever. All right. Bye bye.